Hello, and welcome to our very first FASA podcast, the Leadership Lounge. I am Michelle White, Executive Director of the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I'm Jessica Janasiewicz. I serve as a lobbyist for FASA as well as a number of school districts here in Florida.
And we are so excited to bring you a new way to learn about policy updates in Florida. And so here's a little bit of what you're going to be able to expect from the Leadership Lounge. And each week we are going to go through, especially during the Florida legislative session, a recap of some of the policies that are moving through the process at the Capitol, and we're going to make sure to focus specifically on education policy, as well as a few others that may catch the attention of our senators and representatives. So, once we move out of the legislative session, we'll also continue to focus on some state board rules and other areas where school leadership and policy overlap. So, let's get started. Jessica, can you tell us kind of where we are right now in the legislative process?
Sure. So we have wrapped up interim committee weeks and we are now 1 week into the legislative session, which officially started on March 4th and will run for 60 consecutive days. The start of session is also a time where the governor and our Senate president and our House Speaker share what they hope to prioritize this year. In their opening remarks, we got a little taste of what we can expect. The Senate president talked about scrutinizing state government to ensure that we are being fiscally responsible and government spending is appropriate. He highlighted the need for a review of expenditures to eliminate inefficiencies and redirect those resources to critical areas. He also underscored the significance of maintaining a balanced budget while investing in essential services. We also know he's very focused on rural Florida and is championing efforts to provide resources and other policies that can benefit our rural communities.
Yeah. Go ahead. You want to talk about the speaker too?
Sure, absolutely. So, House Speaker Danny Perez also spoke about fiscal scrutiny and he talked about evaluating state government spending in what he just termed as the age of disruption. He announced the formation of a House working group that's tasked with analyzing budgetary allocations and identifying potential overrides of previous vetoes. So, we do have a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. So, they have the ability, if they choose to do so, to override any of the governor's vetoes of policy or particular budgetary issues. In fact, during the special session that occurred just a few weeks ago, they did just that. They did an override on a particular budget item from the last session, so they could absolutely do so again. And he also said that he is aiming to enhance transparency and accountability within the legislative process.
Yeah. And so um, they're definitely kind of setting that tone for
Mhm.
what we can expect from this session, where they're willing to flex a little muscle if they have to. But we're seeing some of those federal policies and topics that
Mhm.
are happening at the federal level come to Florida, and maybe a little vice versa.
Absolutely. I think we've certainly seen with President Trump that some of the things that he's been talking about in education will sound very familiar to those of us here in Florida because they are a lot of the similar policies that we have seen passed in previous years. And then, of course, yes, whatever happens at the federal level will definitely impact us depending on what they do. So we'll be following that as well. And certainly the legislature will too.
Yeah. And then on opening day, we also had an opportunity to hear from the governor in our state of the state, and he shared some priorities too. So, you want to share just a couple of those?
Absolutely. So Governor DeSantis is now about halfway through his final term as governor. We're at year 6. So he's this is old hat for him coming to do these state of the states now, but we did get some insight as to what he is proposing this year. He wants to look at property tax relief. In fact, he even talked about looking and studying about perhaps eliminating property taxes altogether. Of course, that could have a very big impact on our schools, so we'll watch that. He also talked about ballot initiative reforms. That's something he's been very focused on. He would like to see changes in our ballot initiative process to ensure that proposed amendments align with the state's interests and prevent potential abuses. He wants further work on immigration. Of course, we did have the special session where they did pass an immigration bill, but he is advocating that for mandating that all employers verify workers' immigration status. So that is something to watch. And then he, of course, talked about his support for law enforcement, the importance of supporting those law enforcement officers, proposing salary increases for them to acknowledge that their level of service and education. So he also then talked about our low debt levels and that our commitment in our state to fiscal discipline. And he acknowledged that the legislature is a partner in that, and for as when they are the ones who build the budget, that they do so in a responsible way. So he wants to continue to collaborate with the legislature, he said, to maintain Florida's economic stability.
Nice. So, also, just kind of setting the stage for what we can expect, the only thing that our legislature is required to accomplish in this next
Mhm.
60 days, really less now, is to pass a balanced budget. And
Yep.
it has to be balanced in Florida,
Mhm.
as that requirement
Mhm.
comes. So we're hoping for an on time end of session, right?
Mhm.
Usually by the time we're getting to day 60, we're really worn in and ready for it all to come to an end.
Mhm.
But ultimately, it comes down to that budget being able to be passed on the last day at the right time.
That's exactly right. And so we will see a lot of policy discussions in these first couple weeks of session. And when we transition to that more of the halfway point of session, the budget starts to become the focus. And they'll work on building it. Of course, the House and the Senate will each develop their own budgets. That's kind of the starting point. And then they come together, of course, because ultimately we have one budget that is ultimately passed. So a lot of the policy that we're talking about will occur in these first couple weeks. Not that there won't still be some outstanding. We always have bills that are out there, but they're going to try to get through as much policy as they can in these couple weeks. So the priorities for the Senate president, things like that, will more than likely be heard soon.
Yeah. So stay tuned because we should
Mhm.
be getting Senate and House draft budgets in the coming
That's right.
weeks, and we'll for sure talk about what that means for education. We've of course seen the governor's draft, but
Mhm.
his is a recommendation, and it can be a starting place for our leadership. It's
Absolutely.
just a matter of where they want to go.
Mhm.
But okay, well, let's talk about what happened in this last week of session, really, and committee week. So we've started having some regular committee
Yes.
meetings, and there's been policy that we had discussion around. The first that just to touch on that's not in education, but you mentioned it,
Mhm.
Jessica, is a priority of the Senate President,
Mhm.
Ben Albritton, on rural communities. And so Senator Simon, who is from the North Florida area here in Tallahassee in particular, is running Senate Bill 110.
Mhm.
And it focuses on enhancing support for rural communities. Of course, it passed unanimously from
Mhm.
its very first committee, which we could have kind of expected. And it'll head on to its next committee. So, more updates to come on that. But just know that already there's been some focus put on that bill because I know our president wants to see it come to fruition.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it's typical that leadership priorities would be some of the first bills that go through committee. We had a little bit of a slower start this year because of the special sessions that really kind of impacted what was happening in committee. But now we're off and rolling. And so this week it really did start with those priorities in our committees. We did have the Senate Education Pre-K 12 Policy Committee met this week, and we heard some bills in that committee. One will sound very familiar if you were following legislation last year. Last year, there was a lot of discussion about deregulation of public schools, and we did, in fact, end up with two bills that did deregulate some of how we operate in a number of ways. The Senate is bringing that back for what they're calling this year administrative efficiency in public schools. But I think the president, when he was giving his speech, did say he's calling it DREG 2.0. Some of the tenets of the bill will sound familiar because they actually started a bit where we left off last year. Um, they are there are issues surrounding uh, final assessments. That was probably the most controversial piece of the bill last year. And what their proposal does this year is it looks at the Algebra 1 and 10th grade ELA required assessments. It keeps those assessments in place, removes the requirement that they be a must pass for graduation, and instead has both of those assessments mandated to count as 30% of the final grade. In fact, that's already the requirement for Algebra 1. So this would just add third or 10th grade ELA to that list. So they will still have that assessment. It just won't be a must pass to graduate. So if the student was able to, through their coursework, even if they bombed the test, they could, if they still pass the course, then they would be able to graduate. So there are, of course, many other issues in there, facilities, deregulation, all sorts of things in that bill. And it was heard and passed in its committee this week, its first committee, and it'll move on to the next during this week. This week,
And Senator Simon is also carrying that bill,
yes.
and he's the chair of that Senate Education Committee meeting or committee. And I was just going to share too, like, he is a passionate advocate for this work
Mhm,
and trying to make sure that our schools are able to provide high quality experiences for every student that is in our buildings and making sure that we are preparing them for the workforce. And so I would just encourage anyone that hasn't had an opportunity to kind of watch how he has presented that bill to
mm,
maybe take the few minutes and go over to the FASA website in our advocacy section where we have been talking about this bill and just make sure you watch the little snippet
yes.
of that committee meeting and Senator Simon because he was just really passionate about it last week.
Absolutely, absolutely. He is a major champion for these issues. He knows them extraordinarily well, and he, as you said, he is very passionate in his delivery. So it's definitely worth a watch.
Sure.
Another bill that may sound a bit familiar because we've been talking about it for a while looks at middle and high school start time. So, a couple of years ago, the legislature passed a bill that would mandate specific starting times for middle and high school, but it was not to go into effect for a couple of years. So, we've known it passed a number of years ago, but it hasn't. It had a start date well into the future. So we've known that that's something that some districts have been gearing up to maybe make some changes, or we're looking to see what the legislature was going to do. This bill would essentially remove those requirements and basically make it a local control issue as to what time your schools start. So some folks may already be in compliance. We have some districts that already have their schedules that way. Others do not, and it would just let the local control for those districts to make those decisions in their local communities about what works best for them. That bill also passed that committee
Yeah.
during the Senate Ed meeting last week.
For sure. And so then on the House side, we had the House Education Administration Subcommittee that met and talked about a few bills.
Mhm,
Um, two in particular that we wanted to cover in today is one on hazardous walking
mhm,
conditions. So right now, it is more focused on expanding the criteria for identifying those
mhm,
hazardous walking conditions and there was some passionate
mhm,
public testimony from a parent and from others about ensuring that our students are able to get to school safely and I know that of course safety is always at the top of
mhm,
a leader school leader's mind
mhm,
but we want to make sure that our kiddos can get there. And there was also some discussion around how do we fund transportation
mhm,
and getting those students that are really within the 2 miles from
mhm,
school um, to campus in a safe way when they are walking or biking in areas where they don't have adequate sidewalks or enough space um, and just trying to make it safer. So
mhm,
that bill certainly moved forward. We'll see what comes in the future. But the other bill that I want to talk about, House Bill 123, was introduced and it did pass out of committee, but there was some concern, and there's not a lot to this bill. Like for what it covers, you
mhm,
would expect pages and pages of language, but it's really short.
mhm,
And the biggest thing is that one, it would allow um, for additional ways for schools to be converted to a charter. And it we have pretty open charter conversion here in Florida already, but this would give cities the opportunity to have votes to move a school into a charter, but also really I think where some of our school districts are feeling concern is around um, surplus property
Uh-huh.
and the ability to purchase new
Mhm.
property if they have seen declining enrollment over the last 5 years. And so when our school district stood up and testified this week, they talked a little bit about the fact that they might have surplus property and they could look to get rid of it in areas that are not necessarily growing,
Mhm.
but if they've seen a decline in enrollment,
Mhm.
they would not be able to purchase property where they're seeing more growth in
Mhm.
certain areas of their community, or if they needed to revamp some some
Mhm.
district offices or other things in the growth of the district. So there are some concerns around that. I think that we'll definitely see more challenges to it as
Mhm.
it moves forward, but we do expect it to be heard in the future as well.
Absolutely. And speaking of the future, beyond just what occurred during committees, we also are hearing, of course, discussion about bills that have been filed but have not moved yet. And we know that they will be moving in the future. One issue that we have been hearing from our members, and in fact, I think we're hearing all across the state and the country, is the issue of increased absenteeism, really post COVID, at a pretty dramatic level. The legislature has taken note of that as well, and so we do have bills out there looking at absenteeism. House Bill 1367 and Senate Bill 938 were filed. Both look at defining some of these areas of absenteeism. So, what is, for example, what does it mean to be chronically absent? What is an excused absence versus an unexcused absence? So, that's the way the bills are currently written. But we shall see as it moves through the process. They are not identical right now. So, we'll see what happens as they move through the process. We also have bills that look at high school athletics, and that's two kind of big issues there. One bill is really more of, I think, what we would consider kind of a cleanup bill, if you will, and that's Senate Bill 248. As we have seen throughout statute, and we've seen changes in choice options in Florida. Sometimes the statute takes a little bit of time to catch up, and there is language currently in statute that would limit students that attend non FHSA member private schools that are of a certain size, and it limits them for where they can actually play sports. That really, I don't think, was the intent, but sometimes things happen, and of course, the association has will follow statute, so they want to fix that so that it really is kind of more of an open choice option for students. Then we also have some issues surrounding name, image, and likeness. The FHSAA has a policy already in place, but we have a proposal in the House that would change a bit of what their current NIL policy is. And then there's also language in the Senate looking at agents and things that are working with students on these NIL contracts, and really trying to prevent bad actors in that space. So I think that will continue to be an issue. In fact, we just heard just yesterday afternoon that the Speaker of the House is going to have a special work group on NIL only at the collegiate level. So
Mhm.
that, of course, wouldn't impact our high schools, but we'll watch that because certainly as we saw it develop at the collegiate level, and then it came, of course, to the high school. So we'll see what comes of that work group as well.
Yeah, for sure. Um, the other thing that we know is that the Senate president, one of the other areas that he has said that he would focus on is support for
Mhm.
children and students with autism. And so we've started to see a couple of bills filed around that, mostly increasing access to screenings and access to programs at an earlier age. And so, just hoping to make sure that we have supports for those students and children in our communities and that we can help them grow from an earlier age. And then, while we're talking about some of
Mhm.
our youngest learners, there's a few bills relating to VPK and early learning and what that means. Um, the biggest, I think, that gets some excitement, positive and
Mhm.
negative, is about increasing the number of hours of the VPK day. And so the biggest challenge I think that would come to any of our VPK providers is about the appropriateness of full day instruction. And what does that really look like for a 4-year old sitting um, for instruction all day?
Mhm.
So we will certainly see where those go. They all of the ones that Jessica and I just talked about haven't had their first hearings yet, but maybe next week. So Jessica,
That's
you
right.
want to talk to us? We're already going to be moving into the next week.
Already week 2. We're just plugging along, and in fact, we did, get, at the end of the first week, we got some of the schedules for some of the agendas for some of our committees, and so we know on the Senate side, in the Senate Policy Committee, they are going to hear a number of bills. The school safety bill, which is something that we've anticipated, is going to be on their agenda. The high school athletic bill dealing with the private school students is one of the others on the agenda. They have it 6, 7 bills on their agenda, so it's a much more robust meetings agenda than what we had seen previously in the last couple of weeks. And then in our Senate Education Appropriations Subcommittee, they are actually going to be hearing the DREG 2.0 or Administrative Efficiencies Bill and the middle and high school start times bill. So the two bills that were heard first in the policy committee, their next stop is approach, and they will be heard during week 2.
Great. Well, we are well on our way. And really, FASA is tracking nearly 300 bills already relating to education. Of course, we expect many of those to not pass, but you can always see a full list of them, especially for our members, through our website, of course, which is fasa.net. And we look forward to sharing some more updates with you as we move through this process. Email us some questions and comments. And what do you think of our new Leadership Lounge podcast? The best email and way to reach us is communications@fasa.net. And we look forward to connecting with you. So stay tuned.